Additional support is provided by the Mobil Corporation, Essex Chemical, the American General Corporation, and the Friends of Firing Line.
Hello, I'm Michael Kinsley, editor of The New Republic. Welcome to Firing Line. The United States Senate has voted 23 times in the past 5 years about whether or not to support the Contra guerrillas who are trying to overthrow the Sandinista government of Nicaragua. Yet the matter remains unresolved, either in Congress or in the country at large. Polls repeatedly show that many people don't even know which side we're on in that war, and to the extent they do know, most do not want America involved. As of now, Congress has shut off both military and so-called humanitarian aid to the Contras. But the Contra war also has its strong supporters, including 3 of the 4 candidates for president and vice president this fall. A ceasefire has been in effect in Nicaragua, if not in the United States, since last April. But negotiations for a permanent peace have broken down, and the Sandinistas, after allowing opposition press and political parties to operate with relative freedom for a few months, have cracked down once again. Susan Kaufman Purcell is director of the Latin American Project at the Council on Foreign Relations. She believes that only continuing military pressure can force the Sandinistas to keep their promises of a pluralist society, free elections, and an open economy. Our other guest, Dr. Riordan Roett, is director of Latin American Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington. He opposes American funding of the Contras. Mr. Buckley, let's look at another country near Nicaragua, Mexico. It's a one-party state where they steal elections routinely, they run a semi-socialized economy, they murder the occasional journalist to keep the press in line, and they have only a medium amount of official drug trafficking. Yet we profess repeatedly great friendship with the government of Mexico. Now, would you be willing to settle for a Nicaragua that looks like Mexico, or do we have to have one that looks more like Minnesota, say, before you're willing to call off the dogs of war?
Well, thanks for giving me such egregious powers in the matter. Dr. Purcell and I were both in Mexico a week ago, and I can tell you right now it's no longer a one-party state. But the distinction I think that even you would agree on is that one-party states are in the post-Wilsonian era not things that we worry about unless they are salients of an imperial enterprise. So that, as far as I know, Chad is free to be a one-party state for the rest of my life and my grandchildren's life. But it's different. It would be different if Chad were a satellite of the Soviet Union attempting to corrupt any efforts at democracy in the neighboring area. Do you quarrel with that distinction?
I think the distinction is fair enough as far as it goes, but of course the point is that Nicaragua is not trying to corrupt democracy in the neighboring countries.
Oh, really?
Well, I think that's quite right.
Well, you should stop the presses if you can establish that.
Well, I think that there is a great deal of talk about what Nicaragua is doing from an ideological point of view, and I, of course, admire ideology, but in its proper place, and we can't have ideology obscuring the truth. The truth is that at one point, the Nicaraguans clearly were providing arms for the Salvadoran guerrillas. That has now been reduced to a trickle. It is true that there are Soviet arms being brought into Nicaragua. That has been reduced to fall less than what it was in the early 1980s. I think the Nicaraguan situation needs to be looked at in the context of 1988 and 1989, not in the context of President Reagan's inauguration when he himself took on the Contras as a very personal cause. He is finished. They, too, will soon be finished.
Well, sorry.
No, I think that the fact that the Sandinistas were providing arms, all agree now, in the early 80s and have now stopped, is almost irrelevant. I mean, the point is that Cuba, for example, has gone through the last 20 years, sometimes providing arms, sometimes supporting revolutions and guerrilla movements, and sometimes not. It depends on their calculations as to whether the costs exceed the benefits. And in recent years, the Sandinistas have calculated that the costs of providing arms to insurgent groups in neighboring El Salvador far exceed the benefits, particularly when the Sandinistas are trying to persuade Congress not to provide military aid to the Contras. Once the Contras are dead, then it's not clear what kind of constraints exist anymore against a resumption by the Sandinistas of supporting neighboring guerrilla movements.
Oh, besides which, it seems to me that you don't necessarily have to send arms in order to disrupt a native situation. We have an awful lot of soldiers in West Germany, and there are no arms being sent to the Communist Party in West Germany by the Soviet Union. The fact of the matter is that there's a presence. And if Nicaragua were to succeed in having an unchallenged communist presence there, it would affect the politics of the contiguous states.
Well, I agree. The issue of providing arms, what the Sandinistas provide that's more important than arms is a safe haven, a place where guerrillas from neighboring countries who are under assault by the governments and government troops can meet. They have a safe houses all over Managua.
The way Tunisia did during the Algerian episode.
Yeah, it's very important.
Or the way the U.S. does for right-wing guerrillas as well, operating in Latin America. I mean, there are two issues here that need to be...
What is a right-wing guerrilla? Somebody who wants the Sandinistas to live up to the 1979 agreements?
No, I think that's not really the definition of a guerrilla. I think the definition of a right-wing guerrilla is somebody who is supporting the Contras. Mr. Bermudez, for example, the leader of the Contras, is a right-wing guerrilla, Mr. Buckley. Because
what makes him right-wing? Tell me.
Because he was a member of the National Guard of Mr. Somoza. He was in part, therefore, collectively responsible for the repression of the Somoza regime, which also had a large part to play, it seems to me, in creating the present difficulty.
By the way, many high-ranking members of the Sandinista government are also former members of Somoza's National Guard. I mean, they split in all different kinds of ways.
So they split. I think we really have to differentiate whether we're talking about, at the moment, between the Sandinista regime and where it is going in Nicaragua, and I think the course is quite clear, or whether we're talking about the Sandinista regime as an exporter of revolution, which you collectively seem to believe is going to be the future of the Nicaraguan regime. I don't. The Nicaraguans have made it very clear, time and again, in the last year, they're willing to discuss with the United States. We will not discuss with them. They will discuss with us our security concerns.
They're willing to discuss anything, Mr. Roett. Let's not be naive about it.
I don't think so, Mr. Buckley.
Here's a man, Mr. Ortega, who has publicly declared his enthusiasm for Castro, for Kim Il-sung, and for Brezhnev. Now, it seems to me to simultaneously declare your enthusiasm for those characters and to suggest that you're going to adopt a hygienic attitude about the independence of the countries around you is inconsistent enough to attract you.
Well, it seems to me that we all know that political rhetoric carries us anyway, and therefore Mr. Ortega's fulminations about who he admires are no different than President Reagan's fulminations about who he admires across the political spectrum. Political leaders say various things to accomplish various purposes.
You know, Mr. Roett, if you can't distinguish between Mr. Reagan and Mr. Ortega, we're going to have a hard time having a fruitful conversation.
No, I don't think that's the case at all.
We recognize that Jimmy Carter or Mondale or Reagan can get up and say that Babe Ruth is his favorite person in history if he's trying to appeal to the baseball players. This is a little bit different from saying, I think Hitler is my favorite person. But there's no difference between saying Hitler is my favorite person and saying Kim Il-sung or Castro are my favorite people. And that's what these characters are engaged in.
I wanted to just add something to what, take issue with something that Dr. Roett implied. I mean, it's become very fashionable to say with a slight amount of disdain that the whole idea that the Sandinistas might want to export revolution to neighboring countries is quite incredible or represents a so-called simplistic domino theory. But I think that that's not so far-fetched after all, that if you take into consideration the kinds of countries that surround Nicaragua, the relative fragility of their governments, the incredible poverty that their people live in, the fact that most of these are very small countries, mainly with one capital city, that it wouldn't take so much to bring down a government and to take over neighboring countries. These are not strong, well-institutionalized governments that are neighboring
bringing
countries.
down governments is a national historical pastime in Latin America anyway. I think Bolivia is about to celebrate its 150th coup d'etat. I don't know whether it'll be tomorrow or the day after tomorrow.
But it depends who takes over once the government is brought down.
I couldn't agree with you more. Oh. But I'm simply bolstering the point of instability.
Oh, right, okay.
But certainly, if it were a takeover engineered by the enemies of freedom, economic progress, and democracy, and people who want to mobilize 14-year-olds in order to press their point regionally, it ought not to be something we welcome. Incidentally, do you believe that there should be anything left of the Monroe Doctrine or not?
I think the Monroe Doctrine died with President Monroe, if not somewhat thereafter. I think the basic question we're talking about here, and I think it's a very important question that the two of you need to face up to, is why the United States will not talk with the Nicaraguan government. Why are there no direct negotiations with the government of Nicaragua? We recognize it. We recognize it as a sovereign government. We will not negotiate with it.
There are several reasons. First of all, it is not true that we have not negotiated. We had the Manzanillo talks, which involved 10 different meetings between the Reagan administration representatives and the Sandinistas. The problem, what happens when the United States sits down with the Sandinistas, is actually that our Central American allies, the leaders of these weak democratic governments, suddenly panic because they feel that the United States is about to cut a deal with the Sandinistas and desert them, leave them hanging out on a limb. And so it's been precisely because of the insecurity of our allies in Central America that the United States has been reluctant to engage in bilateral discussions with the Sandinistas. This does not mean that the United States has been unwilling to talk with the Sandinistas, but the United States has argued that such talks should be in a multilateral context as is provided for by the Arias peace plan.
Mr. Ortega has sent a letter to the President calling for bilateral talks. The letter has not even been answered. There is a clear indication in Managua they would like to talk about the security questions. Their lawyer in the U.S. has published an op-ed piece saying those issues are on the table and can be discussed and negotiated.
Mr. Roett, they would like to do anything in Latin America that would distract our attention. They have succeeded marvelously. During the last year, they have apparently acquiesced to all kinds of freedoms. And the moment we have a taste of those freedoms, they clamp down, as they recently did, stopping the national press, continuing their various persecutions. To talk can be a tactic, and it seems to me that wise leadership would recognize that the moment might very well come when one should recognize that as a tactic.
But fair enough, Mr. Buckley, when did the clampdown come? The clampdown came in June when Bermudez, the leader of the Contra army, broke off the talks, and that's been publicly confirmed now. Before that time, there had been an opening all through the previous year.
Why did he break down the talks? Why did he break down the talks?
Because he doesn't want talks. He doesn't want negotiations. He's for war, and we support that.
No,
the U.S. government is supporting that.
There's a very big problem here. Everyone always says they're in favor of negotiations, and everyone says they're in favor of peace, and of course, in the abstract, we all are. The problem is we are asking the Contras to enter into negotiations with the Sandinistas at a time when the Sandinistas continue to receive vast amounts of Soviet armaments and military aid, and the United States Congress has cut off all military aid to the Contras. Well, clearly, when you set up a negotiating process between one side that is heavily armed by the Soviets and the other side that really doesn't even have food and boots, it is a very unequal negotiation which can only lead to one conclusion, which is the surrender of the Contras. I think that to be in favor of negotiations while pulling the rug out from under those people that are negotiating for an opening of the Sandinista regime is rather hypocritical. Keep in mind, if you look at regional conflicts around the world, if you look at Afghanistan, where we supported the rebels and the Soviets are now withdrawing. If you look at Angola, where we supported UNITA and there are now negotiations for withdrawal of the Cuban troops, in those cases where the United States continued to support the rebels and gave them some military capability, the Soviets or the Cubans are negotiating or opening or withdrawing. Why is it that in Nicaragua, the only place where the United States stopped military aid to the insurgents, that is the one place where there are no concessions, no backtracking of any significance? Because
we're not dealing with the Soviets in this case, Dr. Purcell. We're dealing with the Nicaraguan government.
We're
not dealing with the Cubans. We should be dealing with the Nicaraguan government.
The Sandinistas are receiving millions upon millions of dollars of Soviet aid over the last several years.
The issue in Afghanistan and Angola, seems to me, is very, very different geopolitically, and the presence of Soviet troops and of Cuban troops changes the complexion entirely. Of course, the issue for the two of you, of course, to defend is that you understand there is no more Contra aid. There is no more Contra fighting force. It is dissolving. It is disintegrating, and that is a question for the American administration to face in 1989. What do you do with 11,000 Contra fighters?
They can't fight without bullets.
Well, and they're not going to fight because
they have no ammunition.
Well, they're not going to. I'm saying that is the point. There are no more Contra.
If what you're saying is it's a great day because we have deserted our allies, I think you're correct. We have deserted them, and it's an infamous day. And we will pay substantial...
Are you defining the Contras as our allies, Mr. Buckley?
Absolutely.
Oh,
of course they are.
That's just ridiculous.
Well, to the extent that John Quincy Adams was correct when he said that we have friends of freedom fighters everywhere, then they were our allies.
Well, we shall have a chance to prove they're our allies, because it will be very costly to the American people and the American Congress to pay the price now to resettle, to bring into the United States, to provide homes and jobs for all these Contras who have fought the administration's work during the last 8 years. We shall see how much they are our allies.
No, they were not fighting our battle. They were fighting the battle of the people of Nicaragua, and they were fighting for exactly the same principles that were agreed to in 1979, when all parties concerned backed the Sandinista revolution on the basis of its having made public certain prejudice, which they systematically turned their backs on.
I would like to return to something else that Dr. Roett said earlier. He said that the Monroe Doctrine has been dead almost since James Monroe disappeared from the scene. I think this is one of the basic issues that has not been adequately addressed in this whole debate. On the one hand, the Americans don't want their boys to die in faraway jungles or whatever, and that is highly understandable. On the other hand, though, most Americans would not be willing to say that the Monroe Doctrine is dead, that American presidents stand to be defeated if they, quote, lose a country to a communist takeover. Now,
we'd be reduced to the National Guard.
Yeah, Americans can't have it both ways. I mean, we are going to have to decide if we wish to have a hemisphere in which communist expansion is held in check, then we are going to have to do something about it. If we don't care, then that leads to a totally different kind of policy stance. But we can't have our cake and eat it too. We can't say we will not tolerate communist expansion in an area so near the United States and yet be unwilling to do anything or take any sacrifices in order to implement our policy.
But there are prior steps, Dr. Purcell, before we send in the dogs of war, as Mr. Kinsley said before, and the important step is negotiation. There have been no negotiations. Call them regional negotiations, call them bilateral. The administration in Washington has not been willing to talk with the government in Nicaragua. That is the first step to finding out if we do have common security interest or a common area in which we can define our security interests and protect them. The U.S., of course, has a legitimate security interest. Let's discuss how we can protect them and stop the war and move on with development in Central America.
What are they going to talk about that wasn't brought up in 1979? You're suggesting that there are new factors there.
There are new factors.
Dr. Purcell and I think, are suggesting that we want nothing more for Nicaragua than the Nicaraguans themselves voted for, and we backed them in 1979, which says democracy, freedom, and absolute authority to run their own affairs.
I mean, under the Arias Peace Plan, during the last year, until June of this year, when Bermudez destroyed the negotiations, there was an opening in Nicaragua. The opening stopped when Bermudez interfered and made impossible demands on the negotiations, and the negotiations stopped in June.
That is not why the crackdown occurred. The crackdown occurred 2 days before, what was the anniversary? The 9th anniversary of the Nicaraguan Revolution. And it occurred for a very interesting reason, that one of the unanticipated effects of the adoption of the Arias Peace Plan and the ceasefire was that the unarmed domestic democratic opposition within Nicaragua decided to stretch, to try their space, test the space, the political space brought about by the ceasefire and the peace plan. And they started organizing and protesting, etc. And what happened was that the level of internal mobilization, of potential uprising, the threat of potential uprising against the Sandinistas had reached such a point that the Sandinistas had to crack down. What did they crack down on? They cracked down on a peaceful demonstration, a peaceful march in a town 40 miles from Managua, which they could not tolerate 2 days before they were supposed to present this supposedly united front celebrating the great glories that the revolution supposedly brought to Nicaragua.
That's one interpretation, but not the fair interpretation, quite frankly, but that's quite all right. If we're talking about facts here, let's stay with the facts. The facts are very clear.
Well, it's not all right if it's not fair, is it?
Well, the facts are always fair, aren't they? Isn't truth
No.
always fair, Mr. Buckley?
Well,
and that's what we defend here.
But what do you mean? The facts are neither fair nor unfair. Facts or are non-facts.
If we use them appropriately, then it's fair in terms of interpretation. What I'm saying is let's keep the facts clear. The facts are very clear that since the ceasefire took place last year, there was significant progress on liberalization. Not the kind of liberalization I would want completely in Nicaragua.
That's
that
right.
Liberalization has stopped. It stopped why? Because the talks have broken down. The American ambassador allegedly became involved in egging on the opposition in Nicaragua. We then had a breakdown.
Egging on the opposition to do what?
To demonstrate, to protest.
Yeah, to protest in behalf of what? Freedom. Aren't you in favor of egging on the dissenters to ask for freedom.
There are lines and lines of egging on. For example, the American ambassador in Chile is playing a very constructive role opposing the dictatorship of General Pinochet and of working with the opposition. Egging on in that case is quite appropriate because he does it within acceptable limits. No, because it's within acceptable limits.
Well, the acceptable limits? Pinochet does not find the activities of the United States ambassador acceptable. I support them. But I think the main difference is that if Ambassador Barnes in Chile were suddenly transposed to Nicaragua, he would have been thrown out of Nicaragua. He has not been thrown out of Chile. But I want to return to one other thing you said, and this is the whole issue of the fact that the Sandinistas were opening their regime until such point as they were allegedly provoked to clamp down. Well, this just proves the point. I mean, there are openings and there are openings. Some openings are easily reversed, and some openings are not. They are much more substantial and profound. The very fact that it was so easy to close the press, reverse all these supposed democratic gains, shows that they were extremely superficial, and that is their danger. That we must distinguish when we evaluate political openings, those openings that represent irreversible, substantial openings, and those which are basically surfacing cosmetic, which can easily be opened and shut at the whim of the regime.
But openings in Latin America are seldom, unfortunately, irreversible. Everything is reversible in Latin America and the Third World. I would really make the argument that the Sandinistas were beginning to experiment with the 1979 commitments in 1987, and because of the U.S. action and the action of the people you two support, the Contras in Nicaragua, that progress has now been brought to a lamentable conclusion, and I think that's very unfortunate.
I think you missed out on an important fact here, which is they were indeed beginning to experiment precisely because we had, however, episodically backed the efforts of the Contras. Mrs. Kirkpatrick was on this program in May, having just come back from Nicaragua, and she said, for the first time maybe in history, we may see the reversal of a communist Marxist regime. And then I said to her, is this conceivable if we were to withdraw our backing of the Contra? She said, no, in that event, it will not happen. I think she's found to have been prophetic. I regret your lack of enthusiasm for backing those engines in Nicaragua that were bringing about a slow and now reversed a return toward the freedoms promised in the 1979.
Don't feel too badly for me, Mr. Buckley, since I think your interpretation is not my interpretation. That quite frankly, we had a very different situation in Nicaragua in which I think the Sandinista leadership showed themselves to be amazingly flexible in the context of the ODS peace plan. And you'll note that Mr. Schultz had not received the ringing endorsement he expected in June, or in August when he traveled to Central America against the Sandinista regime. There is still a hope for negotiations within the ODS peace plan, support for negotiations, support for U.S. security interest, and this administration in Washington has not taken advantage of the opportunity to sit down and discuss the possibility of protecting American security interests. We are wasting time.
The reason that Secretary Schultz did not receive the ringing endorsement of our allies in Central America is because our allies aren't stupid. What happens is that the Central Americans, our allies, can stick with us strongly, can take certain risks in terms of their opposing the Sandinista regime to the extent that they believe that the United States is behind them and will back them. What is happening now is that the Central American democracies see that military aid to the Contras is probably dead. They all believe firmly that there is going to be a President Dukakis in the United States as of January 1989, who is on record as strongly opposed to the Contras and military aid to the Contras. In that kind of a situation, they know that their fate is tied to that of the United States, and if the United States is basically going to allow the Sandinista regime to consolidate, then they have to face reality and come to terms with this Sandinista regime, which they will now be forced to live with.
And that is all the more reason, if that is true, and I think that scenario is quite accurate, thank God, that we'll have a Dukakis presidency who is opposed to support for the Contras, who are criminals, and that we will finally move on to political negotiations, because quite frankly, it is political negotiations that will finally save the day in Central America to guarantee American security interests and the security interests of our allies in Central America, and to move Central America off the war footing where it has been for the last decade.
I might say the Contras are criminals in exactly the same sense that George Washington was. He broke an oath of allegiance to the king, and decided that we would have an independent country with the kind of Bill of Rights that makes it possible for you to say such preposterous things as that the Contras are criminals. They are criminals only under Bolshevik law, which does not, fortunately, bind this audience.
No, but preposterous comments, Mr. Buckley, often, it seems to me, get at some of the ideological nonsense that has obscured our debate since 1979.
I thought you said you liked that.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, we're out of time. Mr. Buckley, clearly the Sandinistas are prepared to make a deal with us as follows. You let us be an ugly Marxist government internally, and we will behave ourselves externally. Now, that's not a very attractive deal from our point of view, but I think it's enforceable. And the question is, why shouldn't we take it, given the fact that we tolerated the Somoza regime, equally ugly, for many decades, and given the fact that the alternative is more years of slaughter?
May I remind you, Ms. Kinsley, that we made exactly that deal with Castro in 1962. The deal was that we would agree not to topple Castro, and Castro would agree in turn to contain his revolution. There is nobody I know of who is a sophisticated observer of the activities of Mr. Castro since then who believes that he observed that deal. He sent Che Guevara to Bolivia, where he was fortunately killed, having himself killed 65 innocent people in pursuit of a revolution that never materialized. The answer is that no deal with Sandinista, which distorts the dynamism of a Marxist imperialist government, can make sense. The Cubans suffer great privations because they're willing to help the Nicaraguans. The Soviet Union suffers huge privations because they're willing to subsidize revolutions throughout the world. Maybe this will change in the future. We hope that it will. All we know is that it has not changed at this point, and for that reason there is no such thing as a nice, clinically, hygienically, hermetically sealed Soviet satellite in Central America.
Funding for Firing Line is provided by this station and other public television stations, and by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by the Mobil Corporation, Essex Chemical, the American General Corporation, and the Friends of Firing Line. For a printed bound transcript of this program, send $3 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina, 29250.